Some mysteries refuse to stay buried, no matter how much time passes. When Ella Matthews inherited her grandmother's remote farmhouse in Pennsylvania, she expected silence and solitude to heal her broken spirit. What she didn't expect was a golden retriever, muddy and limping, dragging a heavy bag across her property through the morning fog. Inside were tiny clothes from decades past, faded photographs of strangers, and yellowed newspaper clippings about a child who vanished in 1978. The dog kept returning with more unsettling discoveries: a small shoe, a tarnished locket, a pacifier that sent chills down her spine. Each item pulled her deeper into a mystery that seemed to connect to her own family in ways she couldn't understand. As she followed the persistent dog into the dark woods behind her house, Ella realized her grandmother had been keeping secrets that were far more sinister than she ever imagined. What terrible truth had been hidden in these woods for over 40 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to her grandmother's farmhouse had taken Ella Matthews 6 hours through winding Pennsylvania backroads, each mile carrying her further from the wreckage of her former life. 3 months earlier, she had been a respected investigative journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, known for her relentless pursuit of truth and her ability to find the human story buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. Then came the breakdown. It started with insomnia, then panic attacks that would strike without warning during interviews. The final straw came when she collapsed during a city council meeting, her body finally rebelling against months of stress, grief, and a mind that wouldn't stop racing. Her editor, a gruff man named Marcus, who had been like a father to her, insisted she take extended leave. "You're no good to anyone if you're falling apart, Matthews," he'd said, his voice gentler than his words. The inheritance couldn't have come at a better time. Her grandmother Rose had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 93, leaving behind the farmhouse where she'd lived for over 60 years. Ella had spent countless summers there as a child, running through the tall grass behind the house, helping Rose tend her vegetable garden, and listening to stories on the wraparound porch as fireflies danced in the gathering dusk. Now, at 34, Ella found herself returning to that same sanctuary, hoping the quiet isolation would help her piece together the fragments of her shattered confidence. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres of rolling hills and dense woodland, far enough from town that the nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. It was exactly the kind of solitude she craved. The house itself was a testament to another era, built in the 1920s with solid oak beams and stone foundations that had weathered decades of harsh Pennsylvania winters. Rose had maintained it meticulously, updating the plumbing and electrical systems while preserving the original charm. Wide plank hardwood floors creaked pleasantly underfoot, and the kitchen still featured the massive cast-iron stove that Rose had cooked on for decades. Ella spent her first week settling in, going through Rose's belongings with a mixture of nostalgia and melancholy. Her grandmother had been a pack rat, keeping boxes of letters, photographs, and mementos from a life fully lived. In the master bedroom, Ella discovered Rose's personal effects: jewelry boxes filled with costume pearls and cameos, drawers full of handwritten recipes, and stacks of books with margins filled with careful annotations. It was while sorting through Rose's bedside table that Ella found the leather-bound journal. The brown cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and the pages were filled with Rose's careful script. Most entries were mundane weather reports, grocery lists, notes about the garden, but scattered throughout were cryptic references. That made Ella pause. "Watched the woods again today. Still quiet. Mrs. Chun called about Timothy. Told her what we agreed. The secret weighs heavier each year, but some things are better left buried." Ella frowned as she read these entries, trying to understand their meaning. Her grandmother had never mentioned anyone named Timothy or Mrs. Chun. The dates on these particular entries span several decades, with the earliest going back to 1978. The most recent entry was just 2 months before Rose's death. Scout knows. Dogs always know. Frank won't be with us much longer. Someone will need to watch over things. The name Frank struck a chord. Frank Morrison had been Rose's closest neighbor, an elderly widower who lived about a mile down the winding country road. Ella remembered him vaguely from childhood visits. A tall, quiet man with weathered hands who would sometimes help Rose with heavy chores. According to the lawyer who handled Rose's estate, Frank had passed away just a few weeks before her grandmother, dying alone in his house at the age of 87. Ella's first few nights in the farmhouse were peaceful but strange. The silence was so complete that every small sound seemed amplified. The settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant call of owls in the forest. She found herself lying awake, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of rural nighttime sounds, her mind still racing despite her exhaustion. The dream started on her 4th night. She found herself walking through the woods behind the house, following a narrow path she didn't recognize. In the dreams, she could hear a child crying somewhere in the distance, but no matter how fast she walked, she could never reach the source of the sound. She would wake with her heart pounding, the echo of that plaintive crying still ringing in her ears. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman in her 50s named Betty, proved to be Ella's first real contact with the local community. She arrived each afternoon in a battered postal truck, always ready with a smile and the latest town gossip. "Your grandmother was a treasure," Betty told her during one of their brief conversations. "Always had a kind word for everyone, and she never forgot a birthday." The whole community loved Rose Matthews. "Did you know Frank Morrison well?" Ella asked one day, the journal entries still nagging at her thoughts. Betty's expression grew somber. "Poor Frank. He was never quite the same after his wife died, and these last few years were hard on him." Toward the end, he was talking to himself a lot, rambling about old times. His golden retriever, Scout, was really his only companion. Animal control came for the dog after Frank passed, but Scout ran off into the woods. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since. As Betty drove away that afternoon, Ella found herself staring into the tree line behind the house, wondering about the mysterious Scout and the cryptic entries in her grandmother's journal. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in journalism and skeptical inquiry, dismissed these thoughts as the product of stress and isolation. But another part of her, the part that remembered childhood summers filled with Rose's gentle wisdom and endless stories, couldn't shake the feeling that her grandmother had been keeping secrets. That evening, as autumn fog rolled across the hills and settled into the valley, Ella stood at her kitchen window, sipping chamomile tea and watching the mist swirl through the trees. The silence was profound, broken only by the steady tick of Rose's grandfather clock in the hallway. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. Then she saw him, a golden shape moving through the fog, slow and deliberate, dragging something heavy behind him. At first, Ella thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that the shifting mist was creating illusions. But as she pressed her face closer to the window, she could make out the unmistakable form of a large dog, his golden coat matted with mud and burrs, pulling what appeared to be a dark canvas bag across her yard. The dog Scout. It had to be Scout moved with obvious difficulty, favoring his left front paw and stopping frequently to rest. But his determination was clear as he continued his laborious journey, dragging his burden toward the old oak tree that stood near the edge of her property. Ella's journalistic instincts kicked in immediately. She grabbed a flashlight and pulled on her boots, stepping out into the damp morning air. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, creating an otherworldly atmosphere as she approached the spot where she'd seen the dog. The bag was there, just as she'd witnessed, lying beneath the spreading branches of the ancient oak. It was an old military-style duffel bag, the canvas stained and weathered. Scout was nowhere to be seen, having apparently vanished back into the woods as silently as he'd appeared. With trembling hands, Ella unzipped the bag. The contents of the bag took Ella's breath away. Folded carefully at the top were tiny clothes, a child's striped sweater, small denim overalls, and a pair of miniature sneakers that couldn't have fit anyone older than 6 or 7. Beneath the clothes, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect them from moisture, were dozens of photographs. The pictures were the kind taken with an instant camera, their colors slightly faded but still clear enough to make out faces and details. They showed a young Asian boy with a bright smile and mischievous eyes, playing in various locations: a backyard, a playground, what looked like a school classroom. In several photos, he was holding a wooden toy horse, painted red and blue with a flowing yar mane. But it was the newspaper clippings that made Ella's heart race. The yellowed pages were from local papers, dated throughout the fall of 1978. The headlines told a heartbreaking story. Local boy missing. Search continues for Timothy Chun. Community rallies to find missing child. The articles painted a picture of a 6-year-old boy who had disappeared on a crisp October afternoon while playing in the woods near his home. Timothy Chun had been walking home from school when he vanished. His backpack found abandoned on the side of County Road 12, just 2 miles from where Ella now stood. Despite extensive searches involving local police, state authorities, and hundreds of volunteers, no trace of Timothy had ever been found. Ella sank to her knees beside the bag, her mind reeling. As a journalist, she had covered missing persons cases before, and she knew how rare it was for a child to simply vanish without a trace. The rational explanations were usually grim abduction, accident, or worse. But why would Scout, Frank Morrison's dog, be bringing her evidence from a 45-year-old cold case? She studied the photographs more carefully, looking for any clue that might connect Timothy Chun to her grandmother or this property. In one picture, taking what appeared to be at a school function, she could make out other children and adults. In the background, the image was too faded to identify specific faces, but something about the setting looked familiar. The emotional weight of holding these artifacts, a missing child's clothes, his pictures, the desperate newspaper accounts of the search triggered something deep in Ella's psyche. Her hands began to shake, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled an approaching panic attack. The faces in the photographs blurred as tears filled her eyes, and she found herself thinking about all the missing children she'd written about over the years. All the families left behind with nothing but questions and grief. She carefully repacked the bag and carried it back to the house, her mind racing with questions. Inside, she spread the contents across her grandmother's dining room table, organizing them chronologically. The newspaper coverage spanned 3 months, from October 1978 through January 1979, when the active search was finally called off. The last article she found was particularly poignant, an interview with Timothy's parents, Michael and Lisa Chun, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Ella's laptop was already set up on Rose's old secretary desk, and she immediately began searching for more information about the case. The internet yielded frustratingly little about Timothy Chun's disappearance. A few mention in databases of unsolved cases, some archived newspaper articles that repeated the same basic facts she'd already read, and a brief entry on a website dedicated to missing children from the 1970s. What struck her most was how completely Timothy seemed to have vanished from public attention after that initial flurry of coverage. No follow-up articles, no anniversary pieces, no renewed appeals for information. It was as if the community had simply moved on, leaving Timothy's fate as a painful but forgotten mystery. Soft whining sound from outside drew her attention back to the present. Through the kitchen window, she could see Scout sitting near the oak tree, his golden coat catching the early morning sunlight. He appeared to be waiting for something, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the house. Ella stepped outside, moving slowly so as not to startle the dog. Scout watched her approach but didn't flee. Up close, she could see that he was in rough condition, underweight, his coat matted and dirty, with what appeared to be an injured paw. But his eyes were alert and purposeful, and there was something almost human in his expression. "Hello, Scout," she said softly, crouching down a few feet away from him. "Is that really your name?" The dog's tail wagged once tentatively, and he took a small step toward her. Ella held out her hand, letting him catch her scent. After a moment's hesitation, Scout approached and allowed her to stroke his head. His fur was coarser than she'd expected, and she could feel the prominent ridges of his ribs beneath the tangled coat. "You've been taking care of yourself out there, haven't you, boy? But you look like you could use a good meal and some medical attention." As if he understood her words, Scout's tail wagged more enthusiastically. But when Ella stood and started toward the house, gesturing for him to follow, the dog backed away. He took several steps toward the woods, then stopped and looked back at her expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" she asked. Scout barked once, a sharp, clear sound that seemed to confirm her guess. But when she took a step in his direction, he trotted a few yards further into the trees and stopped again, looking back to make sure she was watching. Ella's journalist instincts warred with her common sense. Following a strange dog into dense woods was hardly the smartest thing she could do, especially given her recent mental health struggles. But something about Scout's behavior suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal instinct. And the bag he'd brought her, with its heartbreaking contents and mysterious connection to a decades-old tragedy, demanded investigation. She went back inside and gathered supplies: her cell phone, a water bottle, the small digital camera she'd brought from Philadelphia, and a package of crackers from Rose's pantry. She also grabbed a leash from the mudroom, hoping Scout might allow her to secure him if they found anything significant. When she emerged from the house, Scout was still waiting at the edge of the woods. As soon as he saw her, he turned and began walking deeper into the forest, following what appeared to be a faint but well-used trail. Ella followed, her boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves. The woods behind Rose's farmhouse were denser than she remembered from childhood. Tall oaks and maples created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, giving the whole area a perpetual twilight quality. The trail Scout followed wound through the trees in a seemingly random pattern, sometimes disappearing entirely before reappearing several yards ahead. After about 10 minutes of walking, Scout stopped at the base of a large maple tree. He began digging with his good front paw, whining softly as he worked. Ella knelt beside him and saw that the earth here had been disturbed recently, not by Scout, but by someone or something else. The soil was loose and dark, and as she brushed away the surface layer, her fingers encountered something hard. It was a small metal object, tarnished and dirty but recognizably man-made. Ella carefully extracted it from the earth and wiped it clean with a tissue from her pocket. It was a toy car, red matchbox vehicle that had probably been bright and shiny when it was new. Now it was rust-spotted and scratched, clearly having been buried for a very long time. Scout watched her intently as she examined the toy, his tail wagging slightly when she looked up at him. Then he turned and continued deeper into the woods, following the trail with renewed purpose. Over the next hour, Scout led her to 3 more sites where small objects had been recently unearthed. A child's marble, cloudy with age. A plastic whistle on a faded lanyard. A small wooden block with the letter T carved into one side. Each item was found in the same way. Scout would stop at a seemingly random spot, begin digging and reveal objects that had clearly been buried for decades. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone or something had been systematically uncovering toys and personal items that belonged to a young child. Items that, given their age and the location where they were found, almost certainly belonged to Timothy Chun. But why was Scout bringing these artifacts to light? And how did a dog who belonged to Frank Morrison know where to find evidence from a case that had baffled police investigators for over 40 years? As they made their way back toward the farmhouse, Ella's mind raced with theories and questions. The most logical explanation was that Frank Morrison had known something about Timothy's disappearance, perhaps had even been involved in some way. But Frank was dead now, and Scout was continuing his mysterious work alone. Back at the house, Ella laid out all the items they'd found alongside the contents of the original bag. The collection painted a heartbreaking picture of a young life. Cut short toys and clothes and photographs that should have been cherished family mementos, not evidence in an unsolved mystery. She tried calling the number for the local sheriff's department, thinking she should report what she'd found. But as the phone rang, doubts crept in. What exactly would she tell them? That a stray dog had led her to some old toys in the woods? That she'd found a bag of 40-year-old evidence but had no idea how it had gotten there or why it was being revealed now? The desk sergeant who answered was polite but clearly skeptical when she tried to explain the situation. He took her contact information and promised to have someone look into it, but his tone suggested this was not a high-priority case. After hanging up, Ella felt more frustrated than relieved. Scout had remained near the house during her phone call, lying in the shade of the oak tree and watching her through the kitchen window. When she came back outside, he stood immediately and began walking toward the woods again. "More?" she asked him. "There's more out there?" Scout's response was unmistakable, another sharp bark and a purposeful stride toward the forest. Whatever mission he was on, it wasn't finished yet. But as Ella looked at the collection of heartbreaking artifacts spread across her dining room table, she realized that her own mission was just beginning. Timothy Chun deserved better than to be forgotten, buried in the woods with his toys and his memories. And Scout, despite his animal limitations, seemed determined to make sure that didn't happen. For the first time since her breakdown, Ella felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. The investigative instincts that had made her a successful journalist were awakening, drawn by the mystery of a missing child and the strange behavior of a loyal dog who refused to let the past stay buried. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across Rose's hardwood floors, Ella made a decision. She would follow Scout wherever he led her. She would uncover the truth about Timothy Chun's disappearance, no matter how long it took or what dark secrets it might reveal. And somewhere deep in her heart, she suspected that her grandmother Rose had known this day would come. The next morning brought a steady drizzle that turned the autumn leaves into a slippery carpet beneath Ella's feet. She had spent most of the night researching Timothy Chun's case online, finding frustratingly little new information, but becoming increasingly convinced that the items Scout was revealing were genuine artifacts from the missing boy's life. Frank Morrison's house stood at the end of a gravel driveway that branched off from the main county road. Ella had driven past it several times during her childhood visits, but had never paid it much attention. Now, as she approached the modest two-story farmhouse, she could see signs of recent abandonment, overgrown grass, newspapers scattered by wind and rain, and a general air of neglect that spoke of a property without an owner. The front door was secured with a realtor's lockbox, but Ella found an unlocked window on the back porch that allowed her to climb inside. The house smelled of dust and loneliness, with the particular staleness that comes from a place where no one has lived for several months. Frank's belongings were still scattered throughout the room's dishes in the sink, books on the coffee table, a half-finished crossword puzzle on The kitchen counter dot in the living room. She found what she was looking for, evidence of Scout's presence. A large dog bed sat beside Frank's recliner, surrounded by chew toys and food bowls. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed Frank with Scout at various ages, the dog as a puppy, then a young adult, finally as the mature golden retriever Ella had encountered in the woods. But it was in Frank's bedroom that she made her first significant discovery. Tucked into the back of his closet, behind a row of hanging clothes, was a metal filing cabinet that had been carefully hidden from casual view. The drawers were unlocked, and inside Ella found folders filled with newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes, all related to Timothy Chan's disappearance. The police reports were photocopies, clearly obtained through unofficial channels. They detailed the initial investigation, witness statements, and search efforts with a thoroughness that spoke of professional law enforcement work. But more intriguing were Frank's handwritten notes, which revealed a level of personal involvement that went far beyond normal civilian interest in a local tragedy. October 15th, 1978. Talk to Rose again. She's sticking to her story, but I can see the guilt eating at her. The boy was in her class. She cared about him. November 3rd, 1978. Police called off the active search today. Mother still comes to the woods every afternoon, calling his name. Heartbreaking to watch. December 1978. Rose wants to tell them the truth. I convinced her it would only make things worse. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Ella's hands trembled as she read these entries. Frank Morrison hadn't just known about Timothy's disappearance. He had been directly involved in whatever had happened afterward. And her grandmother Rose had been part of it too. A scratching sound from the back door interrupted her reading. Through the kitchen window, she could see Scout waiting on the porch, his tail wagging tentatively when he spotted her inside his former home. She let him in, and the dog immediately began a methodical tour of the house, sniffing at familiar scents and checking his usual resting spots. "Is this where you and Frank planned your little excavation project?" she asked him. "Why did you two know that nobody else did?" Scout's response was to walk directly to the kitchen and begin pawing at a particular cabinet door. When Ella opened it, she found a metal lunchbox pushed toward the back, behind Frank's collection of coffee mugs. The lunchbox was rust-spotted and dented, clearly having been stored for decades. Inside was a collection of items that made Ella's breath catch in her throat. A school identification card in a plastic sleeve, yellowed with age but still legible. Timothy Chun, Grade 1, Millbrook Elementary School, 1978-1979. Beneath the ID were more photographs, these showing Timothy in what was clearly a classroom setting. And in the background of several photos, Ella could make out a familiar face, a younger version of her grandmother Rose, standing beside a blackboard and smiling at the camera. Rose Matthews had been Timothy Chun's teacher. The revelation hit Ella like a physical blow. She sank into one of Frank's kitchen chairs, the lunchbox clutched in her hands as the implications raced through her mind. Her grandmother hadn't just known about Timothy's disappearance. She had known Timothy personally, had been responsible for his education and well-being during the last months of his life. But if Rose had been Timothy's teacher, why hadn't she been mentioned in any of the newspaper coverage Ella had found? Why hadn't her name appeared in any of the police reports or witness statements? The absence of any official connection between Rose Matthews and Timothy Chun suggested a deliberate effort to conceal their relationship. Scout had been watching her intently during this revelation, and now he moved to the back door and began whining softly. When she looked up, he was looking directly at her with an expression that seemed almost pleading. "You want to show me more, don't you?" she said. "There's something else out there." The dog's tail wagged once, and he began pawing at the door handle. Ella gathered the lunchbox and Frank's files, securing the house before following Scout back into the misty afternoon. This time, Scout led her on a different route through the woods, following a path that seemed more established than the faint trails they'd used the day before. The deeper they went into the forest, the more Ella began to notice signs of human activity, old blazes carved into tree trunks, clearings that looked deliberately maintained, and what appeared to be the remnants of wooden steps leading down a steep embankment. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, Scout stopped at the edge of a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree that must have been growing for over a century. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by fallen branches and accumulated leaves, was what looked like the opening to an old root cellar or storm shelter. Scout began digging immediately, his claws scraping against something metallic buried just beneath the surface. Ella knelt beside him and helped clear away the debris, revealing a metal grate that covered what appeared to be a deep hole in the ground. When she pulled away the grate, a musty smell rose from the opening, the scent of damp earth and old wood and something else she couldn't immediately identify. Scout whined and backed away from the hole, but his eyes remained fixed on the dark opening. Ella used her phone's flashlight to peer into the depths. The beam revealed rough stone walls extending down into darkness, clearly the work of human hands rather than natural formation. This wasn't a root cellar, it was an old well, probably hand-dug by settlers generations ago and long since abandoned. And at the bottom, barely visible in the weak light from her phone, something glinted. "Timothy," she whispered, the word barely audible. Scout whined again, a sound that contained layers of emotion Ella wouldn't have thought possible from an animal. But as she looked at the dog's expressive brown eyes, she realized that Scout had been carrying this burden for years. The knowledge of what lay at the bottom of this forgotten well, the secret that Frank Morrison had taken to his grave. Her phone showed no signal this deep in the woods, and the gathering dusk reminded her that she was alone in an isolated forest with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The responsible thing would be to mark this location and return, with proper equipment and backup. But as she looked down into the well again, she thought about Timothy Chun's parents, who had spent 45 years wondering what had happened to their son. She thought about the newspaper photos of search teams combing these same woods, passing within yards of this spot without ever knowing how close they were to the truth. And she thought about her grandmother Roz, who had carried this secret for decades, unable to tell the truth, but also unable to forget. Scout seemed to sense her internal struggle. He approached the well again, this time carrying a fallen branch in his mouth. He dropped it near the opening and looked up at Ella expectantly. "You want me to go down there?" she said. "You want me to bring him home?" The dog's tail wagged once, slowly, and he settled down beside the well with the patient air of a creature who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Ella looked around the clearing, assessing her options. The well opening was narrow, but not impossibly so, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. The walls appeared to be lined with fitted stones, probably solid enough to support her weight if she was careful. And the flashlight on her phone, while not ideal, would provide enough light to see what was at the bottom. She tested the branch Scout had brought her and found it sturdy enough to use as a makeshift probe. Lying flat on her stomach at the edge of the well, she lowered the branch into the darkness and found that it reached bottom when she extended her arm fully. The well wasn't more than 8 or 9 feet deep, manageable if she was careful. "If I do this," she told Scout, "and something happens to me, you'd better be smart enough to get help." Scout's response was to move closer to the well opening, his eyes never leaving her face. Ella took a deep breath and swung her legs over the edge of the well. The stone walls were rough enough to provide handholds and footholds, and she lowered herself slowly into the darkness. The musty smell grew stronger as she descended, and she could feel the temperature drop noticeably in the confined space. When her feet touched bottom, She found herself standing on a surface that was neither solid stone nor soft earth. Her phone's flashlight revealed that the bottom of the well was covered with a layer of debris, fallen leaves, broken branches, and other organic matter that had accumulated over decades. But scattered throughout this natural debris were items that clearly didn't belong. A child's sneaker, its bright red color faded but still recognizable. A small toy truck, its paint long since worn away. And there, partially buried beneath a pile of leaves, the unmistakable shape of a wooden toy horse with a flowing yarn mane. Ella's eyes filled with tears as she carefully extracted the toy horse from its resting place. It was exactly like the one Timothy had been holding in several of the photographs she'd found, his favorite toy, the companion that had shared his final moments. As she continued to search the bottom of the well, a clearer picture began to emerge. Timothy Chun hadn't been abducted or murdered. He had fallen into this abandoned well, probably while playing in the woods, and had been unable to climb out. The toys and personal items scattered around his remains told the story of a young boy who had spent his final hours trying to reach safety, calling for help that never came. But why hadn't anyone heard his cries? And why had it taken 45 years for his remains to be discovered? The answer, Ella realized, lay in the location of the well. It was deep in the woods, far from any road or trail that would have been used by the search teams. A child's voice, calling from the bottom of this hole, might not have carried far enough to reach rescuers, especially if Timothy had been injured in the fall. And afterward, when the search was called off and the community moved on, the well had been forgotten. Nature had reclaimed the area, covering the opening with fallen branches and leaves, until it became just another depression in the forest floor. Only Frank Morrison and Rose Matthews had known the truth, and they had chosen to keep it secret. But why? What could have motivated them to conceal the discovery of Timothy's body rather than bringing closure to his grieving family? As Ella carefully gathered the toys and other artifacts from the bottom of the well, she realized that the answers to those questions would have to wait. Right now, her priority was getting out of this hole and figuring out how to properly handle the discovery of Timothy Chun's remains. Scout was waiting for her. When she climbed back to the surface, his tail wagging with what looked like relief, he sniffed at the items she'd recovered, then looked up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Now you understand." "I understand that Timothy is down there," she told him. "But I don't understand why Frank and Rose kept it secret. There has to be more to this story." Scout's response was to turn and begin walking back toward the farmhouse, moving with more energy than she'd seen from him before. His mission was far from complete, and he seemed determined to help her uncover the rest of the truth. As they made their way through the darkening woods, Ella's mind raced with questions and implications. She would have to contact the authorities. There was no way around that now. Timothy Chun's family deserved to know what had happened to their son, and his remains deserved proper burial. But she also needed to understand why her grandmother and Frank Morrison had made the choice they did. What circumstances could have led two otherwise decent people to conceal the discovery of a missing child's body? And what role, if any, had other members of the community played in maintaining this decades-long silence? The lights of Rose's farmhouse came into view through the trees, warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. But Ella knew that the peace and solitude she'd sought here had been permanently shattered. She was no longer a grieving journalist seeking refuge from her troubles. She was an investigator on the trail of a 45-year-old secret that had shaped the lives of everyone involved. And Scout, Frank Morrison's loyal companion, was determined to make sure she learned the whole truth, no matter how painful it might be. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with a crisp autumn wind that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oak trees surrounding Rose's farmhouse. Ella had spent most of the night reading through Frank's files and her grandmother's journal, trying to piece together a timeline that would explain How two seemingly innocent people had become guardians of such a devastating secret. The answer, when it finally emerged from the fragmented documentation, was more complex than she had initially imagined. According to Frank's notes, Rose Matthews had indeed been Timothy Chun's first-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary School. But she had also been much more than that. She had been his advocate, his protector, and ultimately, the person who had tried desperately to save him from a home situation that was far from ideal. Frank's careful documentation revealed that Timothy had come to school with suspicious bruises on more than one occasion during the fall of 1978. Rose had filed 3 separate reports with the school administration and local child protective services, expressing concern about possible abuse in the Chun household. But each time, the investigations had been perfunctory, and Timothy had remained in his parents' custody. The most damning entry in Frank's files was a photocopy of Rose's final report, dated just 2 weeks before Timothy's disappearance. Timothy arrived at school today with what appears to be finger-shaped bruises on his upper arms. When asked how he got hurt, he became very quiet and would not answer. This is the 4th incident of suspected abuse I have documented this semester. I am requesting immediate intervention before this child suffers serious harm, but the intervention had never come. The overworked social services department had been slow to respond, and by the time they were ready to investigate, Timothy Chun was missing. Ella set down the photocopied report and stared out the kitchen window, watching Scout as he waited patiently by the oak tree. The dog had become a constant presence at the farmhouse, appearing each morning and staying until dusk, as if he understood that his work was not yet finished. The picture that emerged from Frank's meticulous record-keeping was heartbreaking in its complexity. Timothy Chun hadn't simply wandered away from home and fallen into an abandoned well. He had been running away from abuse, seeking refuge in the woods where he felt safe when tragedy struck. And Rose Matthews, the teacher who had tried so hard to protect him, had been the one to find his body. According to Frank's notes, Rose had been searching the woods behind her property on the evening of October 16, 1978, the day after Timothy's disappearance was first reported. She had been calling his name, hoping that the frightened child might have sought shelter in the familiar forests near the school where she taught. Instead, she had discovered the covered well and heard faint cries coming from within. But by the time she had managed to clear away the debris and peer into the darkness, Timothy was already gone. The fall had been too severe, the injuries too catastrophic. Rose had found not a child in need of rescue, but a young life that had already been lost. Frank's account of that terrible night painted Rose as a woman torn between grief and guilt, devastated by her failure to save the boy she had tried so hard to protect. But what came next was even more difficult to understand. Rather than immediately reporting the discovery, Rose had made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had chosen to leave Timothy where he was, to cover the well again, and to tell no one what she had found. Frank's notes revealed the reasoning behind this agonizing choice. Rose believes that if Timothy's body is found in the woods behind her property, the abuse investigation will be buried along with him. His parents will be seen as victims rather than suspects, and the system that failed to protect him will escape accountability. She wants Timothy's death to serve as evidence of what happened to him, not a convenient way for everyone to forget. It was a decision born of rage and heartbreak, a teacher's desperate attempt to ensure that the child's suffering would not be forgotten or dismissed. Rose had convinced herself that keeping Timothy's location secret would somehow preserve the truth about his abuse, even though it denied his family the closure they desperately needed. Frank Morrison, as Rose's closest friend and confidant, had become an unwilling accomplice to this decision. His files showed years of internal struggle, documenting his own guilt and Rose's gradual recognition that they had made a terrible mistake. But by then, too much time had passed, too many lies had been told, and the secret had become a burden they could neither escape nor reveal. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted Ella's reading. Through the front window, she could see a patrol car pulling up to the house, and her heart began to race. She had called the sheriff's department the previous evening to report finding human remains in the woods, but she hadn't expected such a quick response. The deputy who emerged from the car was a woman in her 40s, tall and lean with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She introduced herself as Deputy Sarah Collins and explained that she was the department's liaison for cold cases and historical investigations. "I understand you found some items related to the Timothy Chen disappearance," Deputy Collins said, as they sat at Rose's kitchen table. "That's a case I'm very familiar with. I actually wrote my criminal justice thesis on unsolved missing persons cases from the 1970s, and Timothy's story was one of the most puzzling." Ella had prepared carefully for this conversation, deciding to reveal the discovery of Timothy's remains, while being deliberately vague about how she had obtained Frank's files and Rose's journal. She explained about Scout's strange behavior, the items he had been bringing to her property, and the subsequent discovery of the well in the woods. Deputy Collins listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When Ella finished her account, the deputy sat back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "This explains a lot," she said finally. There were always aspects of Timothy's disappearance that didn't add up. The location where his backpack was found, for instance, it was almost 2 miles from his house, in the opposite direction from his usual route home from school. We theorized that he might have been taken somewhere else and the backpack planted as misdirection, but we could never prove it. "What about his parents?" Ella asked carefully. "Were they ever considered suspects?" Deputy Collins hesitated before answering. "Officially? No. Michael and Lisa Chun were grieving parents who cooperated fully with the investigation. But off the record, there were some concerns. Timothy had been to the emergency room 3 times in the 6 months before his disappearance, twice for unexplained injuries that could have been consistent with abuse. But the doctor's reports were inconclusive, and Child Protection Services never found sufficient evidence to remove him from the home. So the system failed him. The system in 1978 was very different from what we have today," Deputy Collins said. "There was less awareness of child abuse, fewer resources for investigation, and a general reluctance to interfere with parental rights unless there was overwhelming evidence of harm. Timothy Chun fell through the cracks." They walked together to the well site, Deputy Collins documenting everything with photographs and measurements. The deputy was particularly interested in the construction of the well itself, noting that it appeared to have been deliberately concealed rather than simply neglected. "Someone went to considerable effort to hide this opening," she observed, examining the pattern of stones and debris around the rim. "This wasn't just natural accumulation over time. Branches were placed deliberately to camouflage the hole." Ella felt a stab of guilt as she realized the implications. Her grandmother and Frank hadn't just failed to report Timothy's death. They had actively worked to conceal it, ensuring that his body would remain hidden even from accidental discovery. The recovery operation would take several days to organize, Deputy Collins explained. The remains would need to be extracted carefully to preserve any evidence, and the coroner would have to examine everything to determine the exact cause of death. But based on what they could see from the surface, it seemed clear that Timothy had indeed fallen into the well and been unable to escape. "His family deserves to know," Deputy Collins said as they walked back toward the farmhouse. "Michael Chun died about 10 years ago, but Lisa is still alive. She's in her 70s now, living in a care facility in Harrisburg. And Timothy had an older sister who still lives in the area. They've never stopped wondering what happened to him." After Deputy Collins left, Ella found herself alone with Scout and the weight of the secrets she had uncovered. The dog seemed more restless than usual, pacing around the property and frequently returning to stare into the woods where Timothy's body lay waiting to be recovered. But Scout's agitation wasn't just about the wall site. Throughout the afternoon, he continued to bring Ella small items, not toys or personal effects this time, but pieces of paper. Scraps of notebook pages, fragments of letters, bits of newspaper that had been buried in various locations around. The property thought most of the paper was too damaged to read, destroyed by decades of exposure to moisture and decay. The one piece, protected by having been wrapped in plastic, was still partially legible. It appeared to be part of a letter, written in Rose's careful handwriting. ... Cannot live with this knowledge any longer. Timothy deserves justice, and his family deserves the truth. But I'm also afraid of what will happen when people learn how badly we failed him. The guilt is eating away at both Frank and me. We thought we were protecting his memory, but we have only added to the tragedy by our silence. If anything happens to me, I hope someone will find this letter and understand that we acted out of love for Timothy, not indifference to his families. Paying ... double quotes. The letter broke off there, the rest of the page too damaged to decipher, but it revealed that Rose had, toward the end of her life, been preparing to reveal the truth about Timothy's fate. Perhaps Frank's recent death had prompted her to reconsider their decades-long silence. Perhaps age and illness had made her realize that some secrets were too heavy to carry to the grave. But Rose had died before she could act on her intentions, leaving only fragments of remorse and Scout's strange mission to ensure that Timothy would finally be found dead as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the farmhouse yard. Ella sat on the front porch with Scout beside her, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Tomorrow would bring investigators and evidence technicians, reporters, and official statements. Timothy Chun's story would finally be told, bringing closure to his surviving family, but also exposing the painful choices made by people who had tried to do right in an impossible situation. Scout pressed his warm body against Ella's leg, and she reached down to stroke his graying muzzle. Whatever happened next, the loyal dog had fulfilled his promise to Frank Morrison and Rose Matthews. Timothy would be coming home at last, and the secret that had burdened 3 lives for 45 years would finally be laid to rest. But Ella suspected that Scout's mission wasn't entirely complete. There were still pieces of the story that didn't fit, still questions that demanded answers. And judging by the dog's continued restlessness, he wasn't ready to abandon his vigil just yet. 3 days later, the woods behind Rose's farmhouse had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape marked the perimeter around the well site, and investigators moved carefully through the area, documenting every detail and searching for additional evidence. Ella watched from her kitchen window as the recovery operation unfolded, feeling like an intruder in her own inherited sanctuary. Deputy Collins had returned with a full forensics team, including a specialist in historical recoveries who had experience with decades-old remains. The process was painstakingly slow. Each item had to be photographed in place, carefully extracted, and properly preserved for analysis. But by the second day, they had confirmed what Ella already knew. The remains at the bottom of the well belonged to Timothy Chun. Scout had remained close to the house during the investigation, seeming to understand that his part in the discovery was complete. But his behavior had grown increasingly agitated, and Ella noticed that he continued to bring her items, not just random scraps of paper now, but objects that seemed deliberately chosen. The most significant discovery came on the 3rd morning, when Scout appeared at the kitchen door carrying something that made Ella's heart skip. It was a tarnished silver locket, oval-shaped and delicately engraved with flowing vines and flowers. The chain was broken, but the locket itself was intact, its surface scratched and blackened with age inside. protected by the sealed compartment, was a small photograph. The image was faded but clear enough to make out a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple dress that suggested the picture had been taken in the 1940s or early 1950s. But what took Ella's breath away was how familiar the woman looked, the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, the gentle smile that seemed to radiate warmth and compassion. The woman in the locket looked remarkably like Rose Matthews. Ella turned the locket over and found an inscription on the back, so worn that she had to use a magnifying glass to make out the words, "To my darling Rose, with all my love. Forever yours, James." Her grandmother had never mentioned anyone named James. In all the stories Rose had told about her life, all the family history that had been passed down through generations, there had never been any reference to a romantic relationship before. Rose's marriage to Ella's grandfather William in 1954, but here was evidence of another love, another life that Rose had lived before becoming the grandmother Ella remembered. And somehow, this locket had found its way to the same location where Timothy Chun's remains had been hidden for 45 years. The implications were staggering. If the locket belonged to Rose, what was it doing at the well site? Had she dropped it there during her fateful discovery of Timothy's body? Or was there a deeper connection between Rose's secret past and the tragedy that had shaped the final decades of her life? Ella called Deputy Collins and arranged to meet her away from the active investigation site. They chose a small diner in town where they could talk privately without the distraction of the ongoing recovery operation. "I need to show you something," Ella said, placing the locket on the table between them. "Scout brought this to me this morning. I think it belonged to my grandmother." Deputy Collins examined the locket carefully, using a small LED flashlight to illuminate the inscription. Her expression grew thoughtful as she studied the photograph inside. "This definitely looks like a younger version of Rose Matthews," she said. "But James, that name doesn't appear anywhere in our records of people connected to the Timothy Chun case." "That's because James was from before," Ella said. "Before Rose married my grandfather, before she became a teacher, before any of the life I knew about. You think Rose had a relationship she never told your family about? I think Rose had an entire life she never told anyone about. I'm starting to wonder if that life somehow connects to what happened to Timothy." Deputy Collins leaned back in her chair, her expression troubled. "We found something else at the well site yesterday. I wasn't going to mention it until we had more information, but given what you're showing me, I think you need to know." She pulled out her phone and showed Ella a photograph taken at the bottom of the well. Among the scattered toys and debris, partially buried beneath Timothy's remains, was what appeared to be another skeleton much older and clearly from an adult. "We think there may have been someone else in that well before Timothy fell in," Deputy Collins said quietly. "Someone who had been there for much longer." Ella stared at the photograph, her mind racing. How much longer? Based on the condition of the bones and the artifacts we found with them, probably from the 1940s or early 1950s. We found what looks like military dog tags, but they're too corroded to read clearly. The pieces of a larger puzzle began clicking into place in Ella's mind. The locket with James's inscription, dated from the same era. Rose's mysterious past that she had never discussed with her family. The well that had been deliberately concealed. Not just after Timothy's death, but much earlier. "James," Ella whispered. "The man in the locket inscription. What if he's the one at the bottom of the well?" Deputy Collins nodded slowly. "That's what I'm thinking too. But if that's true, it means your grandmother has been keeping secrets for a lot longer than just 45 years. The revelation cast everything Ella thought she knew about her grandmother in a completely different light. Rose Matthews hadn't just been a teacher who made a tragic mistake in judgment after discovering Timothy's body. She had been a woman carrying the weight of multiple secrets, multiple deaths, for most of her adult life. But what had happened to James? How had he ended up at the bottom of the well behind Rose's property? And why had Rose chosen to build her life on top of such a terrible foundation? That evening, Ella returned to Rose's personal effects with new purpose. She went through every box, every drawer, every hidden corner of the house, looking for any evidence of James or the secret life Rose had lived before becoming a wife, mother, and grandmother. It was in the attic, tucked behind the insulation in a space that hadn't been disturbed for decades, that she found the wooden box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Rose in a masculine handwriting. The return address was partially obscured, but she could make out J. Patterson and what appeared to be a military base in California. The letters spanned several months in 1951 and painted a picture of a passionate romance between Rose and a young soldier named James Patterson. He wrote about his plans to come home after his discharge, about the life they would build together, about his love for the Pennsylvania countryside where Rose lived. But the final letter in the collection was different. Dated March 15, 1952. It was written in Rose's handwriting, apparently a draft of a letter she never sent. My dearest James, I cannot go on with this deception any longer. What happened that night when you came home was terrible, but keeping it secret has been even worse. I know you didn't mean for things to end the way they did. I know you were trying to protect me from your family's anger about our relationship. But I cannot live with the knowledge of where you are, what we did to hide the truth. When people ask about you, I tell them you decided not to come back, that you found someone else. It's easier than explaining that you never really left at all. The letter continued, but the handwriting became increasingly erratic, as if Rose had been crying. While she wrote, I visit you sometimes, especially when the guilt becomes too much to bear. I bring flowers, and I tell you about my life, about the teaching position at the school, about William's proposal. I know you would want me to be happy, to move on and build a life without you. But how can I build a life on such a foundation? How can I accept William's love when I know what I've hidden from the world? Ella's hand shook as she read the final lines. I have decided to accept William's proposal. We will live in the farmhouse, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure your resting place is undisturbed. It's the least I can do after failing you so completely. I love you, James. I will always love you. But I have to find a way to live with what we did. The letter explained everything and nothing. James Patterson had died under mysterious circumstances, and Rose had been involved in concealing his death. But what exactly had happened? Was it an accident, like Timothy's fall into the well? Or was there something more sinister in Rose's past? Scout appeared at the attic window, having somehow climbed onto the roof to peer inside. His presence reminded Ella that the dog's mission extended beyond just revealing Timothy's fate. He had been systematically bringing her evidence of both tragedies, both secrets that Rose had carried. But there was still more to discover. Scout's agitated behavior suggested that he knew something else, something that connected these two deaths in ways that weren't yet clear. And judging by the way he continued to search the property, bringing her fragments of evidence from various hiding places, the complete truth was still buried somewhere in the acres of woodland surrounding the farmhouse. As night fell, and investigators packed up their equipment for another day, Ella found herself standing at the edge of the woods, looking toward the well site where Timothy's remains were being carefully recovered. Somewhere beneath the earth, James Patterson's bones were waiting to be discovered as well. Another victim of whatever curse seemed to hang over this property. Rose Matthews had lived her entire adult life as the guardian of two graves, the keeper of two terrible secrets. She had built a family, a career, and a reputation on foundations that were literally built over death. And now, 45 years after Timothy's tragedy, and 70 years after James's mysterious end, The truth was finally beginning to surface. But Ella suspected that Scout wasn't finished with his revelations. The dog's behavior suggested there were still pieces of the puzzle missing, still secrets waiting to be unearthed from the soil that had hidden so much for so long. The discovery of James Patterson's remains beneath Timothy's body had transformed what was already a complex investigation into something approaching a historical excavation. Deputy Collins returned the next morning with additional personnel, including a forensic anthropologist and a specialist in military records who could help identify the older remains. But it was Scout who provided the next crucial piece of evidence. The golden retriever had spent the night pacing restlessly around the property, and when Ella woke, she found him sitting beside the front porch with something clutched carefully in his mouth. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, but protected by what appeared to be a waterproof wrapping. When she unfolded it, Ella found herself looking at a hand-drawn map of the property, sketched in Rose's distinctive handwriting. The map showed the farmhouse, the surrounding woods, and various landmarks, but most importantly, it showed the exact location of the well, marked with a small cross and the notation J.P. March 1952. Below the map, in Rose's careful script, were detailed directions. From the back porch, follow the deer trail northeast for 347 steps. Turn left at the lightning-struck oak and continue 89 steps to the clearing. The old well is beneath the fallen birch logs, covered with field stones arranged in a spiral pattern. The map was dated 1978, just weeks after Timothy's disappearance. Rose had created this document as a record of where she had hidden both bodies, ensuring that someone would eventually be able to find them if anything happened to her. But why had it taken 45 years for the map to surface? The answer came when Ella examined the waterproof wrapping more closely. It was actually a Ziploc bag, and attached to it was a note in Frank Morrison's handwriting. "Rose made me promise to hide this until we were both gone. She said someday someone would need to know the truth. I'm sorry we waited so long. FM 2023. Frank had hidden the map according to Rose's instructions, keeping it secret until both of their deaths. But Scout, with his uncanny ability to locate buried objects, had found Frank's hiding place and brought the evidence to Ella when the time was right. Deputy Collins studied the map intently when Ella showed it to her later that morning. "This explains how the two bodies ended up in the same location," she said. "Your grandmother put James Patterson's body in the well in 1952. Then when Timothy fell in 26 years later, she chose to leave him there rather than risk exposing what she'd done before. But what happened to James?" Ella asked. "The letter I found suggests Rose was involved in his death, but it doesn't explain how or why. We may have some answers soon." The military records specialist has been researching James Patterson's service history. Apparently, he was reported at WOL from his base in California in March 1952. Just disappeared without a trace. The Army listed him as a deserter, but there was never any follow-up investigation. The picture that emerged from the military records was troubling. James Patterson had been a decorated soldier, a war veteran who had served with distinction in Korea. But his final months of service had been marked by disciplinary problems and conflicts with superior officers. According to his service record, he had been facing court-martial proceedings for insubordination when he disappeared. Men in his situation sometimes went underground, Deputy Collins explained. Changed their names, moved to remote areas, tried to start new lives away from military authority. It wasn't uncommon in the early 1950s. But James hadn't disappeared to start a new life. He had come home to Rose, and somehow that homecoming had ended in tragedy. The forensic examination of James's remains revealed additional details that deepened the mystery. The anthropologist found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull injuries that were consistent with a fall, but could also have resulted from being struck with a heavy object. Without more context, it's impossible to determine whether this was accidental or intentional, the specialist explained to Ella and Deputy Collins. But the injuries were severe enough to cause immediate death. Scouts seemed to sense that the investigation was reaching a critical point. The dog had become increasingly restless, spending his days moving between the well site and various other locations around the property. He would stop at seemingly random spots, dig briefly in the earth, then move on as if searching for something specific. It was on the fourth day of the expanded investigation that Scout's persistence paid off. He led Ella to a spot near the old stone foundation of what had once been a barn, now overgrown with wild roses and brambles. There, buried beneath decades of accumulated leaves and debris, was another metal container, this one larger than Frank's filing cabinet, but similar in purpose. Inside were documents that told the complete story of what had happened in March 1952. The container held Rose's diary from that period, along with newspaper clippings, photographs, and what appeared to be official military correspondence. The diary entries painted a picture of a young woman, desperately in love with a soldier who was increasingly troubled by his experiences in Korea and his conflicts with military authority. James had arrived at Rose's farmhouse on March 12, 1952, 3 days after going AWOL from his base. He was planning to hide there until he could figure out his next move, hoping that the remote location would keep him safe from military police who might be searching for him. But James hadn't come alone. According to Rose's diary, he was being pursued by 2 military investigators who had tracked him to Pennsylvania. They arrived at the farmhouse on the evening of March 14th, demanding that Rose turn over the deserter. What happened next was recorded in Rose's own words, written in the shaking handwriting of someone still in shock from trauma. James panicked when he saw them coming up the drive. He ran toward the woods, and they followed. I heard shouting, then a gunshot. When I reached the clearing, James was lying at the bottom of the old well, and one of the officers was standing at the edge, looking down. The other officer saw me and grabbed my arm. He said James had fallen while trying to escape, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew they had done something terrible. The diary continued with Rose's account of what the officers told her next. They said if I reported what had happened, James would be labeled a deserter and a fugitive, and I would be charged as an accessory for hiding him. They said his family would lose his military benefits and his reputation would be destroyed. They promised that if I stayed quiet, they would report that James had never been found, and his family could believe he had simply disappeared rather than died as a criminal. Rose had been 18 years old, alone and terrified, faced with an impossible choice. She could expose the truth about James's death and face the consequences, or she could protect his memory and his family's honor by keeping the secret. She chose silence. The military investigators helped her cover the well and conceal any evidence of James's presence at the farmhouse. They filed a report stating that their search had been unsuccessful, and James Patterson was officially listed as a deserter who had vanished without a trace. Rose had lived with that secret for 26 years before. Timothy Chung fell into the same well where James's body lay hidden. When she discovered Timothy's body, she was faced with another impossible choice: report the death and risk exposing the earlier tragedy, or maintain her silence and add another burden to her conscience. She chose silence again, but the diary revealed something else that explained Scout's continued agitation. According to Rose's final entries from 1978, she hadn't been alone when she discovered Timothy's body. Frank Morrison had been with her, helping her search for the missing child. And it was Frank who had convinced her that revealing Timothy's location would only create more pain for everyone involved. Frank says we've protected James's secret for 26 years, and we can protect Timothy's too, Rose had written. He says some truths are too painful to bear, and sometimes silence is an act of mercy rather than cowardice. I want to believe him, but the weight of carrying both secrets feels like it will crush me. The partnership between Rose and Frank in maintaining these secrets explained why Scout knew so much about both tragedies. Frank had been present for both discoveries, had helped conceal both deaths, and had carried the burden of both secrets until his own death. But Scout's mission wasn't just about revealing the location of the bodies. The dog was systematically exposing the entire truth, ensuring that the full scope of what had happened on the property would finally be understood. As Ella finished reading Rose's diary, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Her grandmother hadn't been a criminal or a monster. She had been a young woman caught in circumstances beyond her control, making impossible choices in impossible situations. But those choices had created a foundation of secrets that had shaped every aspect of Rose's subsequent life. The investigation team was preparing to expand their search to include the area where James Patterson's remains had been found. The military records specialist was working to contact any surviving members of James's family, and Deputy Collins was beginning the process of determining whether any charges could or should be filed in connection with either death. But for Ella, the most important revelation was understanding her grandmother's true character. Rose Matthews hadn't been the serene, wise woman that Ella remembered from childhood visits. She had been a person carrying enormous guilt and grief, who had somehow managed to build a loving family and a meaningful career despite the terrible secrets she harbored. Scout seemed to understand that his work was nearly complete. The dog's restless energy had settled into something approaching peace, and he spent more time simply sitting beside Ella, as if offering comfort rather than urgency. But there was still one final revelation waiting. Scout's behavior suggested that he knew something else, something that would complete the picture of what had happened on the property over the decades. And judging by the way he continued to return to certain locations, that final piece of the puzzle was still hidden somewhere in the acres of woodland that had kept so many secrets for so long. The revelation that would change everything came on a gray October morning, exactly 1 month after Ella had first discovered Scout dragging the mysterious bag across her property. The forensic team had completed their examination of both sets of remains, and the preliminary reports were confirming what the documentary evidence had already suggested. James Patterson had died from blunt force trauma in 1952, and Timothy Chen had died from injuries sustained in a fall 26 years later. But it was Scout who provided the final piece of evidence that would reframe the entire story. The golden retriever had been unusually restless throughout the night, pacing around the farmhouse and whining softly at the doors. When Ella woke at dawn, she found him sitting beside the front porch with something new, not another artifact from the distant past, but something that looked almost contemporary. It was a wooden toy horse, carved from pine and painted in bright, primary colors. The craftsmanship was excellent, clearly the work of someone with considerable skill and attention to detail. But what made Ella's heart skip was the remarkable similarity between this horse and the one Timothy Chun had been holding in the photographs from 1978. This wasn't Timothy's original toy. That weathered artifact was still in evidence custody. This was a new horse, carved in the same style, but clearly made much more recently. And attached to its base was a small metal plate with an inscription, "For Timothy, from the grandfather who never got to meet you. James Patterson, 1952 to 2023. Implications hit Ella like a physical blow. The dates on the inscription suggested that James Patterson hadn't died in 1952 after all. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived and had lived until just months before Scout began his mysterious mission. Deputy Collins arrived within an hour of Ella's frantic phone call, and together they examined the toy horse with growing amazement. The inscription was professionally engraved, clearly done by someone with access to modern equipment. The wood was aged, but not ancient, suggesting the carving had been completed within the last few years. "If this is genuine," Deputy Collins said slowly, "it means everything we thought we knew about this case is wrong." They drove immediately to Frank Morrison's house, where Scout led them directly to the basement. There, hidden behind a false wall that the previous searches had missed, they found a small room that had been converted into a workshop. The space was filled with woodworking tools, partially completed projects, and dozens of carved animals in various stages of completion. But, most significantly, the workshop contained a comfortable chair, a small bed, and signs of recent habitation. Someone had been living in this hidden room, using Frank Morrison's basement as a refuge from the outside world. On a workbench near the window, they found a leather-bound journal filled with entries in a shaking, elderly handwriting. The first entry was dated 2020. "Frank is getting weaker, and I know my time here is coming to an end. For 70 years, I have lived as a ghost, hiding in the shadows while the world believed me dead. Frank has been my only lifeline to the outside world, my only connection to the truth about what really happened that night in 1952. The journal was signed J.P. James Patterson. The story that emerged from the journal's pages was even more extraordinary than the evidence had suggested. James Patterson hadn't died in the well in 1952. He had been injured, severely enough that Rose and the military investigators believed him dead, but he had survived. When he regained consciousness at the bottom of the well, James found himself trapped but alive. His injuries were serious, a head trauma that had left him with permanent memory problems and physical disabilities, but not fatal. He had managed to survive for 3 days at the bottom of the well by drinking rainwater and eating wild berries that had fallen through the opening dot. It was Frank Morrison who had discovered him, not Rose. According to the journal, Frank had been checking on the property while Rose was away visiting relatives, and he had heard James calling for help from the depths of the well. But instead of immediately rescuing him, Frank had made a decision that would shape the rest of both their lives. The military investigators had already filed their report stating that James was missing and presumed dead. His desertion charges had been dropped due to his disappearance, and his family had been notified that he was lost and unlikely to be found. Frank realized that if James were discovered alive, he would face immediate arrest and court-martial. His military record would be destroyed. His family would learn the truth about his desertion, and Rose would face charges for helping him hide. So Frank made James a deal. He would help him escape and disappear permanently, but James would have to agree never to contact his family or reveal that he had survived. He would become, in effect, a dead man who continued to live. James had accepted the bargain. Frank had helped him climb out of the well, provided medical care for his injuries, and eventually built the hidden room in his basement where James could live in safety. For over 70 years, James Patterson had existed as a ghost, supported by Frank's friendship and protected by the same secret that had supposedly taken his life. The journal revealed that James had never fully recovered from his head injuries. His memory was spotty, his cognitive abilities were limited, and he required constant care. But he had also developed an extraordinary talent for woodcarving, creating the toys and animals that had filled Frank's basement workshop. Most poignantly, James had spent decades carving toy horses in memory of Timothy Chun. He had learned about Timothy's death from Frank, who had shared the terrible secret of the second tragedy that occurred at the well site. James had become obsessed with the idea that Timothy's spirit was somehow connected to his own survival, and he had carved hundreds of horses as a form of tribute and memorial. When Timothy's body was discovered at the bottom of the well in 1978, James had wanted to reveal himself and tell the truth about what had happened. But Frank had convinced him that doing so would only create more pain for everyone involved. So James had remained hidden, carrying the guilt of knowing that his survival had somehow contributed to Timothy's death remaining secret. The final entries in the journal, dated just weeks before Frank's death, revealed James's growing desperation to finally tell the truth. Frank is dying, and soon I will be alone with these secrets. I am 91 years old, and I have spent most of my life as a dead man. But before I die for real, I want Timothy's family to know what happened to him. I want them to understand that their son wasn't forgotten, that someone has been thinking of him and honoring his memory for 45 years. James Patterson had died in Frank's basement just days before Frank himself passed away. But before his death, he had trained Scout to find and retrieve the evidence that would eventually lead to the discovery of both bodies. The dog's strange mission hadn't been the result of animal instinct. It had been a carefully planned operation designed by a dying man who wanted to ensure that the truth would finally be revealed. Scout had been following James's specific instructions, retrieving items from predetermined locations in a sequence that would gradually reveal the complete story. The bag of Timothy's belongings, the toys from the woods, Rose's journal, Frank's files, the locket, the map, all of it had been strategically placed by James in the months before his death, with Scout trained to find each piece at the right time. Deputy Collins stood in Frank's basement workshop, surrounded by decades of carved animals and the evidence of a life lived in shadows, shaking her head in amazement. He orchestrated his own posthumous confession, she said. James Patterson spent 3 years planning how to reveal the truth after his death, using Scout as his messenger. The carved horse with the inscription had been James's final gift, a tribute to the child whose death had been hidden alongside his own supposed demise. It was his way of acknowledging the connection between their stories and his hope that both of their families would finally find peace. But even with this revelation, questions remained. The military investigators who had supposedly caused James's fall in 1952 were long dead, and their role in the tragedy could never be fully verified. Rose's decision to keep the secret had been based on incomplete information. She had never known that James survived, never realized that her silence was protecting a living man rather than preserving the reputation of the dead and Timothy Chun's. Death remained what it had always been. Tragic accident that had been compounded by decades of well-intentioned but misguided secrecy. Scout seemed to understand that his mission was finally complete. The dog had revealed every secret, exposed every hidden truth, and ensured that both James Patterson and Timothy Chun would finally receive the recognition and honor they deserved. As the investigators packed up the evidence from Frank's basement, Scout settled down in a sunny corner of the workshop, looking more peaceful than Ella had ever seen him. The truth was finally free, and the loyal dog who had spent months carrying out his deceased master's final wishes could rest at last. The weeks following the discovery of James Patterson's incredible survival story brought a media attention that transformed the quiet Pennsylvania countryside into a temporary circus. News vans lined the country roads, reporters knocked on doors throughout the county, and the story of the ghost of Millbrook Well captured national headlines. But for Ella, the most important moment came when Deputy Collins arranged for her to meet Timothy Chun's surviving family. His sister, Margaret Chen Williams, had driven up from Baltimore with her adult daughter, both of them carrying 45 years of questions that could finally be answered. They met at Rose's farmhouse on a crisp November morning, with Scout lying peacefully on the front porch as if he understood the significance of the occasion. Margaret was now 51 years old, a grandmother herself. But Ella could see traces of the 6-year-old Timothy in her features, the same bright eyes, the same gentle smile that had shone through in the faded photographs. "I need to understand something," Margaret said, as they sat around Rose's kitchen table. "My parents spent their entire lives believing they had somehow failed Timothy, that they should have protected him better. They died carrying that guilt. But from what you've told me, Timothy was running away from home because he was being hurt. Is that true? The question hung in the air like a weight. Deputy Collins had prepared Ella for this conversation, explaining that the truth about Timothy's home situation would be difficult for his family to hear, but necessary for complete closure. The evidence suggests that Timothy was being abused, Ella said gently. My grandmother filed multiple reports with Child Protective Services expressing concern about suspicious injuries. She was trying to help him, but the system in 1978 wasn't equipped to respond quickly enough. Margaret's daughter reached over and took her mother's hand as tears began to flow. I always wondered, Margaret whispered. Timothy would come to my room at night sometimes, crying, but he wouldn't tell me why. And our parents, they were different. Back then, stricter. Our father especially had a temper that could be frightening. The conversation that followed was painful but healing. Margaret shared memories of her little brother that helped flesh out the picture of who Timothy had been beyond just a victim of tragedy. He had loved animals, especially dogs. He had been fascinated by toy horses and had spent hours playing elaborate games with the carved wooden one that James Patterson had made for him. Where did he get that horse? Margaret asked. I always wondered about it because it wasn't like our other toys. It was so beautifully made. The answer to that question revealed another layer of the story that even Ella hadn't fully understood. According to James Patterson's journal, he had been carving toys for local children for years before his supposed death in 1952. Rose had been one of his customers, buying small wooden animals to give to her students as rewards for good behavior. The horse that Timothy had treasured had been one of James's creations, given to the boy by Rose during his difficult first-grade year. In a strange twist of fate, the toy that had brought Timothy comfort during his final months had been made by the man, whose grave he would unknowingly share. Margaret examined the new horse that James had carved as his final tribute to Timothy, running her fingers over the smooth wood in perfect details. It's beautiful, she said. I can see why Timothy loved the original so much. There's something else, Deputy Collins said, producing a manila envelope from her briefcase. James Patterson left specific instructions about this. He wanted Timothy's family to have it. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in James's shaking handwriting during his final weeks of life. To the family of Timothy Chun, I am a stranger to you, but I have thought about your son every day for 45 years. My name is James Patterson, and I am the reason Timothy's death was kept secret for so long. Not because I caused his death, but because my own supposed death made it impossible for anyone to reveal where his body lay without exposing other secrets. I want you to know that Timothy was loved and remembered. Every toy horse I carved over the past 7 decades was made in his honor. I kept his memory alive when no one else could speak his name. He was a brave little boy who deserved so much better than the world gave him. I hope you can forgive Anne. Old man's cowardice in not revealing the truth sooner. I hope you can find peace in knowing that your son's final resting place was tended and honored, even if it was done in secret. And I hope that someday, when you think of Timothy, you will remember not just how he died, but how much he was loved by people who never even got to meet him properly. With deepest respect and regret, James Patterson. The letter reduced everyone in the room to tears, but they were tears of healing rather than grief. For Margaret, learning that her brother had been remembered and honored, even in secret, provided a comfort she hadn't expected to find. Can we see the place where he was found? She asked. Together, they walked to the well site, which had been filled in and marked with a simple granite stone after the investigation was completed. Scout led the way, moving with the dignity of an honor guard escorting distinguished visitors to a sacred place. Margaret knelt beside the stone and placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the earth that had finally given up its secrets. I used to have dreams about him, she said quietly. Timothy would appear in my dreams, and he always seemed to be trying to tell me something important. But I could never understand what he was saying. Now I think he was trying to lead me here. Deputy Collins had arranged for both families, Timothy's survivors and James Patterson's distant relatives, to meet at the site together. James's great-niece had driven up from Virginia, carrying photographs and military medals that told the story of the young soldier who had vanished in 1952. My great-uncle was a war hero, she explained as they gathered around the memorial stone. He earned a Purple Heart in Korea and was recommended for promotion before everything went wrong. Our family always wondered what happened to him, whether he had been captured or killed, or just decided to disappear. We never imagined he had spent 70 years living in hiding just a few miles from where he was supposed to have died. The meeting between the two families was surprisingly warm, united by their shared experience of loss and their mutual gratitude for finally learning the truth. They decided together to expand the memorial stone, adding James Patterson's name alongside Timothy Chun's and including a brief inscription that would honor both men without revealing the painful details of their stories as the families made their plans. Ella found herself watching Scout, who had positioned himself beside the memorial stone like a faithful guardian. The dog's transformation over the past month had been remarkable, from the desperate, driven animal she had first encountered to this peaceful, dignified creature who seemed to understand that his work was finally done. What will happen to Scout now? Margaret asked, echoing Ella's own thoughts. The question of Scout's future had been weighing on Ella's mind for weeks. The dog was clearly attached to the property and to her, but he was also aging and would need medical care in a stable home. Frank Morrison had no surviving relatives, and Scout had no legal owner. "I'd like him to stay here," Ella said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice, "if that's all right with everyone. He belongs here with the secrets he helped reveal, and I think I belong here too." The decision to remain permanently at Rose's farmhouse hadn't been conscious, but as soon as Ella spoke the words, she knew. They were true. Over the past month, she had found something at the farmhouse that she hadn't expected, a sense of purpose, a connection to family history, and a piece that had been missing from her life since her breakdown. Deputy Collins smiled at the announcement. "I think that's exactly what Scout has been hoping for, and what Rose would have wanted too." The investigation was officially closed the following week, with the coroner ruling Timothy's death an accidental drowning and James's case being classified as a historical incident that was beyond the statute of limitations for any potential charges. The military had agreed to restore James Patterson's honorable discharge status and provide a proper burial with full honors. But the most meaningful resolution came from Margaret Chen Williams, who announced her family's decision to establish a scholarship fund in Timothy's name at Millbrook Elementary School. The fund would support children who were at risk or in need of extra attention, exactly the kind of intervention that might have saved Timothy if it had been available in 1978. "Timothy's death can't be undone," Margaret said at the announcement ceremony. "But maybe we can prevent other children from falling through the cracks the way he did." Rose's farmhouse had been transformed by the events of the past month, but not in ways that Ella had expected. Rather than feeling haunted by the secrets that had been revealed, the property now felt lighter, as if the truth had lifted a burden that had been weighing on the land for decades. Ella had found Rose's final journal entry, written just weeks before her death. "I have carried these secrets for so long that they have become part of who I am. But I am tired now, and I want to rest. I hope that someday someone will find the strength to tell the truth that I could never bring myself to reveal." Timothy and James both deserve better than to be forgotten in silence. If there is any way for the dead to forgive the living, I pray they will forgive an old woman who tried to do right but chose poorly so many times." Reading those words, Ella understood that her grandmother's final gift hadn't been the farmhouse itself, but the opportunity to set things right. Rose had known that the secrets would eventually surface, and she had trusted that the person who inherited her property would have the courage to face the truth. Scout seemed to understand that his vigil was over. The dog spent his days exploring the property with a carefree attitude that Ella had never seen before, playing in the yard and chasing squirrels like a much younger animal. But each evening, he returned to the memorial stone for a few minutes of quiet sitting, as if paying his respects to the friends whose stories he had helped reveal. The media attention gradually died down, and the country roads returned to their usual quiet. But the story of the ghost of Millbrook, well, had touched people across the country, inspiring discussions about child protection, military veterans' rights, and the power of secrets to shape entire communities. Ella had begun writing again, not journalism this time, but a book that would tell the complete story of Timothy Chun, James Patterson, Rose Matthews, and Scout. She wanted to capture not just the mystery and its resolution, but the human cost of keeping secrets and the healing power of finally telling the truth. As winter settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, Ella found herself at peace for the first time in years. The farmhouse that had once harbored such dark secrets had become a place of healing and hope. Scout had taught her that sometimes the most important truths are revealed not through investigation or analysis, but through loyalty, persistence, and love. And somewhere in the quiet woods behind the house, where the memorial stone stood as a testament to two lives that had been lost but not forgotten, the past had finally been laid to rest. The funeral for James Patterson took place on a cold December morning with full military honors at the Millbrook Cemetery. The Army had expedited the process of restoring his honorable discharge, and a color guard from the nearest military base performed the ceremony with precision and dignity. Ella stood beside Margaret Chen Williams and her family, watching as the flag was folded and presented to James's great-niece. Scout sat quietly at Ella's feet, wearing a black ribbon around his collar in tribute to the man who had been his secret companion for the final years of both their lives. The cemetery was fuller than anyone had expected. Word of James's story had spread throughout the veteran community, and dozens of elderly soldiers had come to pay their respects to a brother-in-arms who had been lost for 7 decades. The local VFW post had provided an honor guard, and the American Legion had arranged for a bugler to play taps. But it was Timothy Chun's memorial service, held the following week, that truly brought the community together. Margaret had decided to hold the service at Millbrook Elementary School, in the same classroom where Rose Matthews had tried so hard to protect her young student. 45 years earlier, the school had been renovated several times since 1978, but the basic structure remained the same. Ella found herself imagining Rose as a young teacher, standing at the blackboard and watching Timothy struggle with reading lessons while hiding the bruises that told the story of his home life. The memorial service drew an unexpected crowd. Former students of Rose's came to pay their respects, along with teachers who had worked with her during her long career. But most moving were the families who had been touched by child abuse and neglect, people who understood that Timothy's story represented thousands of children who had fallen through the cracks of an imperfect system. Margaret spoke about her brother with a clarity and strength that surprised everyone, including herself. Timothy was 6 years old when he died, she said, standing at the front of the classroom where he had spent his final months. But in those 6 years, he touched more lives than he ever knew. He was loved by a teacher who fought for him, remembered, by a stranger who carved toys in his honor, and rescued from obscurity by a dog who refused to let his story remain buried. The scholarship fund that had been established in Timothy's name had already raised enough money to help a dozen at-risk children in the local school district. The fund would provide counseling services, emergency assistance for families in crisis, and training for teachers to recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Timothy's death was a tragedy, Margaret continued. But his life had meaning, and his memory will continue to protect other children for generations to come. Scout had become something of a local celebrity, with visitors regularly stopping by the farmhouse to meet the dog, who had solved a 70-year-old mystery. But Ella was careful to limit his exposure, understanding that Scout was an elderly animal who deserved peace and quiet after his months of dedicated service. The veterinarian who examined Scout estimated his age at somewhere between 12 and 14 years old, well into the senior range for a golden retriever. But despite his age, Scout showed remarkable vitality and seemed to thrive on the attention and affection he received from the steady stream of visitors. Deputy Collins had become a regular presence at the farmhouse, stopping by several times a week to check on Ella and Scout, and to share updates on the ongoing investigation into historical child abuse cases. The revelation of Timothy's story had prompted the department to review dozens of unsolved missing persons cases from the 1970s and 1980s, looking for patterns that might have been missed by earlier investigations. Your grandmother's documentation has been invaluable, Deputy Collins told Ella during one of her visits. Rose kept meticulous records of her concerns about several children over the years, and we're using those files to reopen cases that were closed prematurely. The impact of the investigation extended far beyond the local community. The story of the ghost of Millbrook Well had been featured in national magazines and had inspired a documentary film crew to begin production on a feature-length exploration of the case. But Ella had insisted that any media coverage focus on the broader issues of child protection and veterans' rights, rather than sensationalizing the mystery aspects of the story. Her own book about the experience was nearing completion, and she had signed with a publisher who specialized in true crime stories with social justice themes. The advance had been substantial enough to allow her to make necessary repairs to Rose's farmhouse and to establish a small emergency fund for Scout's ongoing medical care. But the most meaningful development was the establishment of the Millbrook Truth and Reconciliation Project, a community initiative designed to encourage other families to share long-hidden secrets that might help solve cold cases or provide closure for grieving relatives. The project was housed in a small office space, donated by the city, and it was staffed entirely by volunteers who had been trained to handle sensitive historical information. Within just 3 months of its establishment, the project had received over 200 inquiries from people who had information about unsolved disappearances, suspicious deaths, and other historical mysteries. Margaret Chen Williams had agreed to serve as the project's first director, bringing her experience as a social worker and her personal understanding of how secrets could impact families across generations. Her first major success came when an elderly woman contacted the project with information about a child who had disappeared in 1963, leading to the discovery of remains and the resolution of a case that had haunted 2 families for 60 years. Timothy's story taught us that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Margaret explained during a radio interview about the project. Our goal is to provide a safe space for people to share what they know, so that other families don't have to wait decades for answers. Scout seemed to understand the importance of the work being done in Timothy's name. The dog had developed a habit of visiting the elementary school during recess, sitting quietly near the playground and watching the children play with an expression that seemed both protective and peaceful. The children had adopted Scout as their unofficial mascot, and several of them had written letters to him that were displayed in the school's main hallway. One letter from a 7-year-old named Emma captured the impact that Scout's story had on the young students. Dear Scout, thank you for finding Timothy and bringing him home to his family. My teacher says you are a hero dog because you never gave up. I hope when I grow up, I can be brave like you and help people who are lost find their way home too." As winter deepened and the anniversary of Ella's arrival at the farmhouse approached, she found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in just 1 year. The broken journalist who had fled to Pennsylvania seeking solitude and healing had been transformed into someone with purpose and community connections that she had never expected to find. Spring arrived early at the farmhouse, with daffodils pushing through the last patches of snow and the woods behind the property coming alive with the sounds of returning birds. Ella had spent the winter months completing her book and preparing for its publication, but she had also been working on something more personal, a comprehensive restoration of Rose's farmhouse that would honor its history while making it suitable for modern living. The restoration project had become a community effort, with local craftsmen donating their time and expertise to preserve the farmhouse's historical character while updating its infrastructure. The work had revealed additional artifacts hidden in the walls and foundation letters, photographs, and small mementos that told the story of the property's century-long history. But the most significant discovery came when workers renovating the basement found a hidden compartment that had been concealed behind a false wall. Inside was a collection of items that James Patterson had accumulated during his 70 years of secret residence. Photographs of the local children he had watched grow up from his basement window, detailed wood-carving plans for toys and decorative items, and a final letter addressed to Scout. The letter was written in James's trembling handwriting, clearly composed during his final days. "My faithful friend, you have been my companion and my connection to the world for these past years. When I am gone, you will know what needs to be done. You have watched me hide the evidence, and you understand where each piece can be found. Trust the woman who inherits this place. She has the heart of a truth seeker and the courage to see this through to the end. Lead her to each hiding place in the proper order, and help her understand that some secrets are kept not from cruelty, but from love. You are a good dog, Scout. You are the best friend an old ghost could have asked for." Reading James's letter, Ella finally understood the full scope of what Scout had accomplished. The dog hadn't just been following random instincts or responding to scent trails. He had been executing a carefully planned mission designed by a dying man who wanted to ensure that his story would be told with compassion and understanding. Scout seemed to sense that this final revelation marked the true completion of his work. The dog's behavior had mellowed considerably over the winter months, and he now spent most of his time sleeping in sunny spots around the farmhouse or taking leisurely walks through the woods that had once held so many secrets. The book's publication in early summer brought renewed attention to the story, but this time the focus was on the lessons that could be learned rather than the sensational aspects of the mystery. Ella had worked hard to ensure that Timothy's and James's stories were told with dignity and respect, emphasizing the human cost of keeping secrets and the importance of truth-telling in healing communities. The book tour took her to dozens of cities across the country, where she spoke to audiences of social workers, veterans advocates, and families who had been affected by missing persons cases. At each event, she carried with her a photograph of Scout sitting beside the memorial stone, and she always ended her presentations with the same message: truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. Our responsibility is to create safe spaces for people to share what they know, and to respond with compassion rather than judgment when difficult truths come to light. The success of the book had exceeded everyone's expectations, but for Ella, the most meaningful response came from readers who wrote to share their own stories of family secrets and long-hidden truths. Many of these letters led to contacts with the Millbrook Truth and Reconciliation Project, which had expanded its services to include a national hotline and online resources for families dealing with historical mysteries. Margaret Chen Williams had proven to be an exceptional leader for the project, combining her professional skills with her personal experience to help dozens of families find closure. The project had successfully resolved 18 cold cases in its first year, including several that had been unsolved for over 30 years. Timothy would be proud, Margaret said, during the project's first anniversary celebration. His story has become a bridge between the past and the present, helping other families find the answers they've been seeking for so long. Scout's health had begun to decline as summer progressed, and Ella found herself spending more time simply sitting with him, enjoying his quiet companionship and reflecting on the extraordinary year they had shared. The veterinarian had warned that Scout's advanced age meant his time was limited, but the dog seemed content and peaceful, showing none of the restless anxiety that had driven him during his months of revelation. The local newspaper had commissioned a follow-up article about Scout's current life, and the photographer who came to take pictures captured a beautiful image of the elderly dog lying in a patch of sunlight near the memorial stone, surrounded by wildflowers that had grown up around the marker. The photograph became iconic, reprinted in magazines and websites around the world as a symbol of loyalty, persistence, and the power of love to transcend even death. But for Ella, the image simply captured the essence of who Scout had always been: a faithful friend, who had never given up on his mission to bring peace to the souls who had been lost in the woods behind Rose's farmhouse. As autumn approached, Ella began preparations for the first annual Timothy Chun Memorial Day at Millbrook Elementary School. The event would combine a scholarship fundraiser with educational presentations about child protection and historical preservation. The highlight would be the unveiling of a new playground structure that had been designed to include elements from Timothy's story wooden horses, a small bridge representing the connection between past and present, and a memorial garden where children could learn about the importance of speaking up when someone needs help. Scout had become increasingly frail as the weather turned cooler, but he seemed determined to participate in the Memorial Day festivities. On the morning of the event, he walked slowly but steadily to the school, taking his customary position near the playground where he could watch the children play. The ceremony drew hundreds of people from across the region, including many of the families who had been helped by the Truth and Reconciliation Project. Margaret spoke movingly about her brother's legacy, and several former students of Rose's shared memories of the teacher who had tried so hard to protect the children in her care. But the most touching moment came when a group of current first graders presented Scout with a special collar that they had decorated with small wooden horses, each one carved by a local craftsman in tribute to James Patterson's memory. Scout accepted the honor with dignity, allowing the children to pet him gently while he rested in the shade of an oak tree that had been planted in Timothy's memory. That evening, as the crowds dispersed and the school grounds returned to quiet, Ella and Scout made one final visit to the memorial stone in the woods behind the farmhouse. The dog moved slowly but purposefully, stopping to rest several times during the short walk at the memorial site. Scout settled down beside the stone with a deep sigh, his head resting on his paws as he gazed into the gathering twilight. Ella sat beside him, stroking his graying fur and reflecting on the incredible journey they had shared. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You brought them both home, and you helped heal more hearts than you'll ever know." Scout's tail wagged once, slowly, and he closed his eyes with the peaceful expression of a job well done. In the fading light, surrounded by the woods that had kept so many secrets for so long, the loyal dog who had solved the mystery of the ghost of Millbrook, finally allowed himself to rest. Scout passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days after the memorial ceremony, curled up in his favorite sunny spot on the farmhouse porch. Ella found him there on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after their first encounter, looking as serene and dignified in death as he had been loyal and determined in life. The news of Scout's passing spread quickly through the community, And within hours, people began arriving at the farmhouse to pay their respects to the dog who had become a symbol of hope and healing for so many. Children left drawings and flowers. Veterans saluted quietly, and families who had been helped by the Truth and Reconciliation Project shared stories of how Scout's mission had touched their lives. Margaret Ten Williams drove up from Baltimore for Scout's funeral, bringing with her a wreath made from Timothy's favorite flowers, sunflowers and black-eyed Susans that now grew wild around the memorial stone. "Scout gave us our brother back," she said simply. "The least we can do is say goodbye properly." The funeral was held in the clearing where the memorial stone stood, with Deputy Collins officiating and nearly 200 people in attendance. Scout was buried beside the stone, his grave marked with a simple granite marker that read, "Scout Faithful, Friend and Truth Keeper." He never stopped believing that love could overcome secrets. The collar decorated by the first graders was buried with him, along with one of James Patterson's carved horses and a letter from Timothy's sister thanking Scout for his service to both families. As the last shovel of earth was placed over the grave, a golden butterfly landed on the memorial stone and remained there throughout the rest of the ceremony, as if offering its own tribute to the dog who had brought so much peace to this quiet corner of Pennsylvania. In the months that followed, Ella found herself adjusting to life without Scout's daily presence, but she was not alone in her grief. The farmhouse had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people arriving regularly to visit the memorial stone and to learn about the story that had unfolded there. Ella had established a small museum in Rose's front parlor, displaying artifacts from the investigation alongside information about child protection, resources and veteran services that the Millbrook Truth and Reconciliation Project had grown into a nationally recognized organization with satellite offices in 12 states and a staff of trained counselors who specialized in helping families resolve historical mysteries. Margaret had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing Timothy's story and explaining how communities could create safe spaces for truth-telling and healing. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Scout's mission was the change it had brought to Ella herself. The broken journalist who had arrived at the farmhouse seeking isolation and healing had been transformed into someone with deep roots in her community and a clear sense of purpose. She had been elected to the school board, where she championed programs for at-risk children, and she had established a small foundation that provided emergency assistance to families dealing with child protection issues. The second anniversary of Timothy's Memorial Day brought an unexpected surprise. A young family from the next county arrived at the farmhouse carrying a golden retriever puppy, barely 8 weeks old. They explained that their dog had given birth to a litter, and when they heard Scout's story, they knew that one of the puppies belonged at the farmhouse. "His name is Hope," the mother explained as she placed the wiggling puppy in Ella's arms. "We thought Scout would want someone to continue watching over this place." Hope was nothing like Scout Playful, where Scout had been serious, curious about everything rather than focused on a specific mission. But as Ella watched the puppy explore the farmhouse grounds, she could see traces of Scout's gentle nature in the way. Hope approached the memorial stone with respect and settled down quietly in the sunny spot on the porch where Scout had spent his final days. The puppy quickly became a beloved fixture in the community, visiting the elementary school regularly and providing comfort to children who were struggling with difficult situations at home. Hope wore Scout's original collar, the one Frank Morrison had put on him years earlier, but with a new tag that reads simply, "Hope Carrying on the Watch." 5 years after Scout's death, Ella published a second book that focused on the lasting impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Project and the dozens of families who had found closure through the organization's work. The book included a chapter about hope and a new generation of children who were learning about Timothy's story through the educational programs at the school. The memorial stone had been expanded to include a small amphitheater where school Groups could gather to learn about local history and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. A bronze plaque near the stone told the complete story of Timothy Chun, James Patterson, Rose Matthews, Frank Morrison, and Scout, ensuring that their interconnected tales would be preserved for future generations. Margaret Chen Williams had retired from her position with the Truth and Reconciliation Project, but remained active as a consultant and speaker. At 60, she had finally found peace with her brother's story and had become a grandmother herself, often bringing her grandchildren to visit the memorial site where their great-uncle was honored. Timothy was just 6 years old when he died. She told her grandchildren during one visit, but his story helped save hundreds of other children who might have been lost or forgotten. That's the real magic of this place. It transforms tragedy into hope. The woods behind the farmhouse had been designated as a nature preserve, ensuring that the land that had held so many secrets would remain undisturbed and accessible to future generations. A walking trail now connected the memorial stone to the site where the old well had been located, with interpretive signs that explained the geological and historical significance of the area. But for Ella, the most meaningful change was the transformation of the farmhouse itself from a place of hidden secrets to a center of healing and community connection. The rooms that had once harbored guilt and grief now rang with laughter and conversation as visitors shared their own stories and found comfort in the knowledge that truth, no matter how long buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had departed and hope was settled for the night, Ella would sit on the front porch and remember the morning when she had first seen Scout, dragging his mysterious burden across the yard. She often wondered what would have happened if she had turned away, if she had chosen to ignore the dog's strange behavior and maintain her own isolation. But Scout had been too determined, too loyal to his mission to allow that to happen. He had understood, in whatever way that animals understand such things, that some truths are too important to remain buried, and that healing can only begin when secrets are finally brought into the light. The golden retriever had kept faith with two lost souls for over 40 years, carrying their stories in his heart until he found someone with the courage and compassion to help him share their burden. In doing so, he had not only brought peace to Timothy Chun and James Patterson, but it also created a legacy of hope that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. As autumn settled over the Pennsylvania countryside once again, painting the woods in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Ella knew that Rose's farmhouse had finally become what it was always meant to be, not a keeper of secrets, but a sanctuary where truth could flourish and healing could begin. And somewhere in the peaceful darkness beneath the memorial stone, she liked to imagine that Scout was still keeping watch, his loyal spirit ensuring that no lost soul would ever again be forgotten in these woods where love had finally conquered silence.